When the 1930s began, the world still adored Charlie Chaplin, the little tramp who made millions laugh through silent films. But behind the laughter, a storm was rising in Europe. Hitler had risen to power, his fiery speeches echoing through German cities, his armies already reshaping the map of the continent. And while politicians debated, one man thousands of miles away watched the unfolding nightmare with growing unease. Chaplin had noticed something eerie. As he studied Hitler's public rallies, his mannerisms, and even his mustache, he realized, almost humorously, that the world's most feared dictator looked remarkably like the world's most beloved clown. But that resemblance was more than physical. Both had risen from poverty, both were master performers in front of massive crowds, and both knew how to manipulate emotion, one for joy, the other for hatred. At first, it was just a passing thought. But soon that thought became an obsession. Chaplin couldn't ignore the parallels. And as the 1930s darkened, he began to imagine a film that could strip away the myth of Hitler's power, not through violence, but through laughter. He would use comedy as a weapon, the only one he knew. But even before he wrote a single line, Chaplin knew the risk. Hollywood was terrified of controversy. The United States was still officially neutral. Studios avoided anything that could offend Germany, one of their biggest markets. Making fun of Hitler wasn't just unpopular, it could be career suicide. And yet, Chaplin decided to do it anyway. In 1938, as Europe watched Hitler march into Austria, Chaplin locked himself away in his studio. There he began crafting a story about a cruel dictator named Adolf Hitler, a grotesque mirror image of Hitler, and a humble Jewish barber who looked just like him. The idea was bold, dangerous, and deeply personal. Chaplin, himself not Jewish, felt a human obligation to stand up against tyranny. He said later, "I could not have made The Great Dictator had I known the full horror of the concentration camps, but I wanted to ridicule their insanity." The world was shifting fast. Hitler's real army was invading nations, while Chaplin built his army of filmmakers and set designers. Every scene he imagined was a risk. Rumors spread that Nazi sympathizers in America were watching him closely. German newspapers had already listed Chaplin as a Jewish film clown, even though he wasn't Jewish. But that didn't matter. His voice was now the enemy's target. By mid-1939, filming began. The set was massive, the most ambitious of Chaplin's career. His usual light-hearted crews were uneasy. "We're mocking a man who's conquering Europe," one of them whispered. "If this goes wrong, it'll destroy us all." But Chaplin pressed on, directing, acting, writing, and composing every note of music. He transformed comedy into courage. Then the unthinkable happened. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The Second World War had begun. The world was at war, and Chaplin was in the middle of shooting a comedy about the man who started it. Even his friends begged him to stop. The studio executives panicked. They told him this film could bankrupt him and turn public opinion against him. Chaplin refused. He said, "If I must go down, I'll go down laughing at the monster." The production continued through chaos. The sets of Tamania, his fictional fascist empire, were filled with actors in parody uniforms, flags that resembled swastikas but weren't quite the same, and slogans that mocked Nazi ideology. For the first time in his career, Chaplin added spoken dialogue. He knew silence was no longer enough. The world needed words, and he was ready to speak. The film's satire cut deep. Hinckel's speeches, a mix of gibberish German and overblown theatrics, were a perfect mirror of Hitler's rallies. The absurdity was unmistakable. But behind the comedy was fury, a rage at injustice and cruelty. The humor exposed the fragility of tyranny, showing that dictators depend not on strength, but on fear. By early 1940, the film was nearly finished. Chaplin poured everything he had into the final moments, a speech unlike anything seen in cinema before. It wasn't the clown speaking, but the man himself. He spoke to the soldiers, to the oppressed, and to the world. "We think too much and feel too little," he wrote. "More than machinery, we need humanity." Those words were dangerous. In a time when neutrality was law and fear was profit, Chaplin had crossed the line between entertainment and defiance. The press warned him not to release it. Diplomats begged him to wait. But he didn't. In October 1940, The Great Dictator premiered in New York City, just months after France had fallen and Britain stood alone against the Nazi war machine. The reaction was electric. Audiences laughed, cried, and stood in stunned silence at the final speech. But the film also divided the world. Some called him brave. Others called him reckless. Nazi Germany banned the film immediately. In America, isolationists accused Chaplin of dragging the U.S. into a foreign war. The FBI began watching him closely. And yet across the Atlantic, soldiers fighting in Europe carried reels of The Great Dictator in their pockets. To them, Chaplin wasn't just a comedian, he was a voice of hope. In the darkest days of war, laughter became resistance. Chaplin had done what no politician had dared. Through humor, he had exposed the world's most feared dictator and risked everything to do it. But that courage would soon come at a heavy price. When The Great Dictator hit theaters in late 1940, the world was on fire. Europe was under siege, London was being bombed nightly, and America was still clinging to neutrality. But inside darkened cinemas, audiences found something they hadn't felt in years, laughter mixed with truth. Charlie Chaplin's film dared to mock Hitler's madness, and for a brief moment, comedy became courage. The movie spread across Allied nations like wildfire. In Britain, despite air raids and rationing, theaters sold out night after night. Soldiers cheered the parody of their enemy, and newspapers hailed Chaplin as a moral voice in a world gone silent. But not everyone was cheering. In the United States, the response was far more complicated. Many Americans still believed the war in Europe wasn't their concern. Isolationist groups accused Chaplin of using his fame to push political propaganda. Pro-German voices called the film an insult to a legitimate leader. Even some Hollywood executives whispered that Chaplin had gone too far. The FBI took notice and a file with his name began to grow. Still, Chaplin stood by his film. He knew the dangers of silence. To remain neutral, he once said, is to stand with the oppressor. But courage has a cost, and soon the consequences of defying tyranny would begin to haunt him. After the United States entered the war in 1941, Chaplin's film became a symbol of Allied unity. The same government that once hesitated to support him now used The Great Dictator as a morale booster. His speech at the end of the film, pleading for humanity, peace, and kindness, was broadcast to troops overseas. It inspired many, reminding them that even in chaos, compassion mattered. But peace did not last. When the war ended in 1945, the world's attention shifted. The Nazi threat was gone, but a new kind of paranoia was beginning. In America, the early Cold War era saw fear replace understanding. The Red Scare was rising, and anyone who spoke too freely about peace or equality was suddenly suspect. Chaplin's ideals, once praised as courageous, were now labeled dangerous. His outspoken support for human rights, his criticism of greed, and his refusal to fit into political boxes made him a target. The same government that once distributed his film now questioned his loyalty. By the late 1940s, newspapers were filled with stories attacking his personal life. Rumors, scandals, and false accusations swirled around him. He was called un-American, a foreign agitator, even a communist sympathizer. The laughter that once united people now turned into whispers of suspicion. Then came the final blow. In 1952, as Chaplin sailed to London for the premiere of his new film, U.S. officials revoked his re-entry visa. The man who had made America laugh for decades was told he was no longer welcome. He had risked everything to speak against tyranny, and now he was being punished by the freedom he once defended. He chose not to return. Switzerland became his new home, far from the studios of Hollywood. There, in quiet exile, Chaplin reflected on his life and the strange fate of his most daring work. The Great Dictator had changed the world, but it had also changed him. It stripped away the mask of comedy and revealed the man behind it, a man who believed that art must confront power, no matter the cost. In the years that followed, time began to heal what fear had broken. The world started to see the truth. Historians recognize The Great Dictator not just as a film, but as one of the most powerful acts of defiance ever captured on screen. Chaplin's performance as both the cruel dictator and the humble barber became a mirror for humanity, the reflection of what we are and what we could be. When he finally returned to America in 1972, it was not as a criminal but as a legend. The Academy Awards honored him with a Lifetime Achievement Oscar. As he stood before the audience, tears in his eyes, the crowd gave him a 12-minute standing ovation, the longest in Oscar history. Decades after he had risked everything to expose a dictator, the world finally understood what he had done. Chaplin never saw himself as a hero. He once said, "I'm just a clown, nothing more." But history disagreed. The courage to mock a monster when others stayed silent was no small act. He turned laughter into a weapon of truth, and in doing so, reminded humanity that even in the darkest times, conscience must not be silenced. The Great Dictator remains more than just a film. It's a testament to the power of art, the weight of moral responsibility, and the bravery of one man who dared to tell the truth through comedy. When Hitler banned Chaplin's films in Germany, it wasn't out of anger, it was out of fear. Because dictators cannot bear to be laughed at, and Chaplin made the world laugh, not at jokes, but at evil itself. In the end, Chaplin's message still echoes across generations. The fight against hate never truly ends, and courage often comes from the most unexpected places. One man with a camera, a stage, and a vision stood up to tyranny and left behind a lesson for all time. He showed that laughter, when born from truth, can change the world.